Hello, I'm your everyday average Jonathan. Join me this week while I turn this and this into this, a battle-ready Viking spear. Hello, I'm your everyday average Jonathan. I'm an ordinary guy with ordinary tools making extraordinary items. Well, it would seem that I have spears coming out my ears. In the last month, one of my build projects was a Roman pilum, which is essentially a Roman throwing spear. And then on a whim, I heard from a friend who mentioned something about seeing that build and wanting a throwing spear for her 10-year-old daughter. And so I made one for her as a surprise. And right in the same time frame, I was approached by a nice couple to make what they call a battle-ready spear. And when I heard battle-ready, two things went through my mind. First thing was, these people are speaking my language. Second thing was, oh crap, this better be good. I better make this really well. You see, when someone comes to you and says something with the words battle ready for a fantastical or medieval weapons build, that tells me that they know a thing or two about what they're looking for. So that's what we'll be building this week. The spear is going to be my own design, but it's going to follow maybe a Viking or maybe an Elven aesthetic. I'll be honest, I'm a little bit nervous about this one. So without further ado, let's get to the shop and get started. We're not going to get too far into the history of the spear. Essentially, though, the spear is a form of what's called a pole arm or a pole weapon, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's a weapon that's attached to a long staff or a long wooden arm. Not always made of wood, sometimes they're made of metal as well. But besides the club, the spear is one of the oldest weapons or implements in human history. The oldest surviving example that we know of is about 400,000 years old, and it was an all-wood spear that the head of it was a sharpened piece of wood on a long arm. The particular spear that I'm going to be making is going to be what's called a battle spear. To me, that means the design is going to be something that is used for thrusting or slashing rather than throwing. Without any doubt, there are hundreds of neat designs for spears and spearheads that are out there. I wanted to craft something that had both a Viking and Elven qualities to it. Viking for the hardened, powerful look and feel, and Elven for the lines and the hidden elegance, perhaps. I'm a very visual person. Some of the design ideas that have stuck with me over time and that I've wanted to use on this project are motifs that actually I am not very good at. I seem to be all right with things that are more curvy or flowy in design, but one of the aesthetics that I really like, and I'm certainly not naturally good at all, are the designs that incorporate both the elements of curves but also angularity to them as well. I think back to the fairy tale story of Sleeping Beauty and the character Maleficent, and when I first saw the cartoon, the Disney cartoon as a young child, this character of Maleficent terrified me. The design elements of that character have really stuck with me though. The good folks at Disney created a design in her headdress and in her robes that has both curves and yet angularity to it. It's a combination of things that I think is really, really fascinating because oftentimes you see one or the other. You see either just curves or just angles, but in this particular design, as you will see, they incorporate both. Both the hooks that I'm going to make on this, but also the guard for the spear, I'm going to try to incorporate that curvy and yet angular design aesthetic. I don't know if every designer does this, but I certainly fall hard onto graph paper when I'm creating the design. I do it freehand for the most part, but then graph paper just helps me to stay within the bounds. This particular piece of steel that I got is 1080 cold rolled steel. It's a really good blade steel, but it's probably better for tool blades of sorts, axes, sickles, scythes, and spears. I thought long and hard about how I wanted to do this. I really wanted to forge this blade from a solid piece of stock. But as a blacksmith, I am just not good enough yet to get to that point where I did it. So buying 1/4 inch thick plate of 1080 and cutting it out was what I ended up going with. I also knew that I wanted to have a spine that went down the center of the blade. It was raised up a little bit, and there was going to be a lot of grinding work on this. But the first thing I needed to do, which is fascinating, I don't do this much, was going to be to cut in the lines of this particular spine so that I define the outline and I can grind away from it on each side. Complete impulse buy. That little green blade that you see on the angle grinder, I purchased that from a ad that I saw on some feed somewhere on an impulse. They called it the indestructible blade. It was not very indestructible, so I ended up switching back to just to grindstones. And I'll save you the heartache of having to watch the countless minutes, hours of grinding and grinding. I used multiple different types of grindstones, but really I ended up using the flap wheel that got me the farthest. And each time I did, the blade would get so hot that I would have to come outside, coat it with snow, bring it back in, and start the process over. Now the hooks that I'm going to make for putting on the bottom of the blade, I'm making out of 8-inch steel that I've had on stock. And as you'll see me doing here, I am trying to capture that curvy yet angular aesthetic that I was looking for. The blade itself has a long curve, so contrasting it with a little bit of something angular, but not too angular. I don't want it spiky. I don't want it like a spine. I want it to have a little bit of elegance, a little bit of grace. So cutting these two out, sandwiching them together with these vice grip pliers, and then profiling the rest, got them down to where I could go ahead and weld them onto the spear. One of the great things about being an amateur blacksmith and having so much snow is anytime you need to cool off your metal, you can just go outside, drop it in the snow. But here you see that spine in living color. Looks great. It was straight as an arrow. Something interesting would happen to it later on, which we'll get to. I'm tack welding the hooks on one at a time, then I make little micro adjustments to make sure that they are true and that they follow the same line of the blade. Once they look true and straight, I go ahead and weld them completely on. I will end up doing even more grinding on this blade, as you will see here once I get these welds set in. I'm going to go ahead and weld on this long handle too, because I'm going to heat quench and heat treat this particular blade. And while it's hot is a great time to go ahead and put in the artist touch mark that I have, as well as I'm going to make what I call occlusions. That's probably not the right word, but I'm going to use it. My father, the geologist, would be proud of me for using it. That's where I'm going to go ahead and distress and give it that hammered, that textured look that is just part of my ethos. I cannot do without that. I actually thought long and hard about making this a very polished, very, very shiny and smooth blade because of the Elven nature to it. I just can't bring myself to do it. It's not something I look at and enjoy. But that said, I'm also trying to quench this the right way. So I'm doing two things. I'm preheating the oil and then applying a magnet to it. Once it's lost its magnetic properties is usually the time that it has reached the chemical balance to quench it. One of the methods that you can use to identify highly intelligent people is simply this. When you see somebody putting a molten piece of metal and fire within a Home Depot plastic bucket filled with hot oil, you have found yourself an extremely intelligent person. The third thing that I'm trying to do right this time, I have done this before, but I just sort of got away from it, is baking this at about 400 something degrees for a couple hours. That supposedly releases the tension in the metal. We'll see. It actually, I did do the file test on this, which is another test to see if it quenched and hardened well. And I'll be darned. It actually, the file was not biting into it. It was giving it just a little bit of a polish. So now, using the angle grinder and this flap wheel, I'm going to go ahead and profile the rest of the blade. I asked the customer if they wanted this ludicrously sharp enough to cut paper, sharp enough to cut a tomato, and then I recommended strongly to them that they go with tool sharp because it is essentially going to be a tool. And if it's too sharp, once they whack something with it, which I'm sure that they're going to do, and I hope that they do, it'll probably chip or crack or even mar the blade. With a lot of things, once I get them hammered and textured to my liking, I will hit them with the wire wheel and just remove some of the scale, not all of it, but some of it. And now I'm going to make the guard. I saw a whole lot of designs on different types of guards, but for one reason or another, most of the designs followed a really specific layout, and it was something that I just thought, why isn't there more options? So I just made this one up. I'm creating my own, going with that circular and angular aesthetic. The guard is a very important piece on a spear. So unlike the hooks, I made this also from that 1/4-inch piece of 1080 cold rolled steel. So it's going to be a very, very physical piece, very present, thick, and it's going to be able to accept the weight or take the weight of a weapon, something like an axe coming down, something like a sword or another polearm coming down on it. The customer actually went and bought this piece of ash. It's a 7-foot piece of ash round, and they had it shipped to me, and I'm very impressed with it. Very, very hard, very straight, and when you grind into it, it smells like no other wood that I've ever smelled, because I don't normally use ash. I've spent a lot of time with conifers and pines, but it has a very specific odor to it. I can't say that it's a pleasant odor, but I was very delicate with it along the way, because I'm sure it didn't cost them much more than $1 billion. So I wanted to make sure I took care of it. Now, I failed miserably on the last socket that I designed, so I was bound and determined to get socket making the right way. And I'm going to use this pipe. This is a slightly different pipe. It's a little bit thicker walled than the one that I used previously. I am still using that green cutoff wheel. Didn't work at all. Went to a regular cutoff wheel, as you can see here. But it's very fascinating. After learning from my mistakes from the previous spear, I was bound and determined to come back and make this socket correctly. And I'll be darned if I didn't make the exact same mistakes. What are those mistakes, you would ask? Well, my engineering friends would understand this immediately if they saw me laying this out. With that cloth tape measure, I measured, but what I didn't get right was on the pipe, the socket that I was making, I measured the outer diameter of that pipe each time, and I compared it with the outer diameter of the handle. That was where my error was. I should have been measuring the inner diameter, and thus making the socket a lot bigger, a lot larger in circumference, which is really what it needed to be. But of course, you do need to take a break and every now and then just look at what God has provided for you in terms of view and nature. So just like the other socket that I made, I had to make a little bit of a wedge of the same pipe material and stick it in here. And if you look closely, that's probably the best welding I think anyone has ever done in Colorado. But it does clean up really good. The sander and the grinder do a good job for me. Also learning from the last socket that I made, where I had lots and lots of open space at the top where the spearhead connected. I'm going to go ahead and insert the spearhead about 3/8 of an inch, maybe almost 1/2 inch into the socket, and then weld that on there. And as you'll see, I will then heat it up and hammer it closed and weld it again. That worked out actually quite well. It's very solid and it looks pretty good. Here I am applying the guards, tack welding them on and then completing them fully with the welds. This actually took a whole lot more time because they really need to be symmetrical. I am very symmetrical in my eye, almost to a curse, I suppose. Things just bug me to death when they are ever so slightly out of symmetry. But this lined up pretty well. These did good. Now, a lot more grinding is going to ensue, and boy, the flap wheel on the angle grinder just does such a good job. You can be delicate with it, you can be aggressive with it. In the end, the welds looked great because of all the grinding that I had to do. I'm going to go ahead and put one 16-penny nail in there, so I went ahead and drilled that hole. And then I decided that I just don't like the notion of a spear having a wooden shaft that just touches the ground and sits on the ground, because that's really how it's going to be held most of the time, with the spearhead up and the butt end down. So I made this what I would call a cap to put on the butt end, just to keep that wood from rotting and absorbing moisture and cracking. One of the really neat things about this ash handle, got to be careful how I say that, was that it weighs a lot. So the balance on the spear and putting that cap on there, it felt great. I did oil darken the spearhead several times to get it back up to that darkness that I wanted, and then hitting it with a sanding brush draws out those occlusions, that characteristic that I'm looking for. It makes it look old, it makes it look hand-hewn. I love it. I decided that I wanted to put some grip features, if you will, onto the handle where the holding hand, the thrusting hand, is going to be situated. Nothing crazy, but just something to give it a little bit of texture, a little bit of personality down there. I did ask the customer if they wanted me to char this or leave it as that white ash color, and she said a light charring would be great. So here I am. I did end up making the grip portion much darker, which I think looks great. With the spearhead secured on, I put a 16 nail through it, used that as the rivet. And last piece of refinement is just touching it up with some boiled linseed oil to give it a little bit of weatherproofing on top of the char that I gave it. I really like the way it came out. I'm very impressed with it. It would absolutely be a formidable weapon in any shield wall or for any guard or for any warrior. One of the things I just find exceedingly interesting about this particular spear and battle-ready spears like this is that only other handful of weapons like them, you could call them a melee weapon, but they can be used hand-to-hand, but also as a projectile. They can also be thrown. So a very multifaceted weapon. I think that the customers are going to really like it.
All right, well, thank you for joining me for that build. This was a good build. I'm proud of this build. Okay, straight in. There's a couple features that I want to show you as long as I can get my horse to get out of the way. First things first, I wanted to make this cap that I put on the end here on the butt end strictly because it just strikes me that as a combatant and you're in a shield wall or you're traveling or you're waiting for something or a sentry and you're going to be having your spear resting on the ground like this, you're going to be in wet, muddy, snowy, rainy, dry environments, whatever. And if there was wood on the bottom of this, well, it would constantly be warping, cracking, absorbing moisture, and having horses bug the crap out of you. Hi. Mwah. Hello. So putting a metal cap on that and putting a metal butt end on really anything that's going to be making lots of contact with the ground just makes sense to me. It's just something I wanted to do. Okay, another feature that I wanted to do too, and this is just something that I added, is these little nubs that I cut out. They serve as grips essentially for where the hand is that's going to be doing the thrusting. So if you're thrusting with this spear, which is what the spear is made to do, then this hand here, you're probably going to let the spear move past and through the hand. But this hand here has to have some really good purchase on something. It's not going to be moving, most likely. So to have something like this back there, I wanted to make sure that I created that. Okay, moving up to the head of the spear. I've seen quite a lot of these particular guards, different designs, different aesthetics, but they are present on, especially on thrusting spears and on pole arms. These are just guards for the hand. They're made to shield the hand that's thrusting, to shield you from a weapon coming down to catch that weapon. It's essentially just like the guard of a sword. It's made to capture and protect you. Further to that though, I made these hooks on the edge of this very intentionally. I like the design of it. I wanted to give it this design, but it does serve a purpose. And here's what that purpose is. You take a sword, and as the sword comes down and it is captured here or blocked here, but then really what you can do is you can capture that, pull it back, twist it, and now you have something that you can really purchase, potentially disarming, pulling it out of the hands of, or at the very least kind of discombobulating the combatant that you're facing so that you can gain an advantage. Anytime you can capture or latch onto the enemy combatant's weapon or shield or armor or horse or whatever, you gain an advantage right off the bat. Okay, last piece that I wanted to show you, and it may be a little bit difficult to see this on the camera, but there is a spine that goes up the blade of this, that goes up the center of the blade. And when I cut and ground this spine, it was straight as an arrow, as you can see on the footage. When I went to forge this and heat treat it and actually used the hammer on it quite a bit, I hammered up quite a bit on the spine. And what's really fascinating, and I don't know if you can see this spine takes a slight curve in it. The spine on this side still remains perfectly straight. What's fascinating to me is this blade did not warp, did not bend, did not change its shape when I was hammering on it, but the spine of it did on one side only. The only thing that I can think of as to why that happened, and I'm going to ask around to some of my blacksmithing friends, is some sort of differential in the heat treatment, some sort of heat differential between pieces of material. But I still don't know why the spine on one side would have a very slight curve to it while the blade is not curved, and on the other side the spine and the blade are perfectly true and symmetrical. Very fascinated by that. Thank you again for joining me for this. This was a lot of fun. I'm going to deliver it to the young couple that commissioned it, and I'm excited to see what they have to say. Next week, join me. I'm actually going to be making horse head armor for some horse that you see right here. I'm going to be making a piece of horse head armor that's going to have some cool accents to it, some interesting design features to it that are going to be my own. I'm pretty sure there's nothing more in the world that this young lady wants than to have some horse head armor on her. But being that her breed is a gypsy vanner, she has a little bit of work horse in her and some draft in her, I think it's very apropos that she has some great horse head armor. So that's what we'll be building next week. Until then, God bless. Thank you for joining me.